Welcome, everybody. Today we're going to read some of Heidegger's Basic Problems of Phenomenology. I'll just share my screen now. This is the book we're going to read on page 36. Albert Hofstadter. And we're going to the introduction. Exposition and general division of the theme. This course, and we have a footnote immediately, the new elaboration of Division 3 of Part 1 of Being in Time, sets for itself the task of posing the basic problems of phenomenology, elaborating and proceeding to some extent towards their solution. Phenomenology must develop its concept out of what it takes as its theme and how it investigates its object. Our considerations are aimed at the inherent content and inner systematic relationships of the basic problems. The goal is to achieve a fundamental illumination of these problems. In negative terms, this means that our purpose is not to acquire historical knowledge about the circumstances of the modern movements in philosophy called phenomenology. We shall be dealing not with phenomenology, but with what phenomenology itself deals with. And again, we do not wish merely to take note of it so as to be able to report then that phenomenology deals with this or that subject. Instead, the course deals with the subject itself, and you yourself are supposed to deal with it or learn how to do so as the course proceeds. The point is not to gain some knowledge about philosophy, but to be able to philosophize. An introduction to the basic problems could lead to that end, and these basic problems themselves. Are we to take it on trust that the ones we discuss do in fact constitute the inventory of the basic problems? How shall we arrive at these basic problems? Not directly, but by the roundabout way of a discussion of certain individual problems. From these we shall sift out the basic problems and determine their systematic interconnection. Such an understanding of basic problems should yield insight to the degree to which philosophy as a science is necessarily demanded by them. The course accordingly divides into three parts. At the outset, we may outline them roughly as follows. 1. Concrete phenomenological inquiry leading to the basic problems, and 2. The basic problems of phenomenology and their systematic order and foundation. 3. The scientific way of treating these problems and the idea of phenomenology. The path of our reflection will take us from certain individual problems to the basic problems. The question therefore arises, how are we to gain the starting point of our consideration? How shall we select and circumscribe the individual problems? Is this to be left to chance and arbitrary choice? In order to avoid the appearance that we have simply assembled a few problems at random, an introduction leading up to the individual problems is required. It might be thought that the simplest and surest way would be to derive the concrete individual phenomenological problems from the concept of phenomenology. Phenomenology is essentially such and such. Hence, it encompasses such and such problems. But we have first of all to arrive at the concept of phenomenology. This route is accordingly closest to us. To circumscribe the concrete problems, we do not ultimately need a clear-cut and fully validated concept of phenomenology. Instead, it might be enough to have some acquaintance with what nowadays familiarly known as the name phenomenology. Admittedly, within phenomenological inquiry, there are again different definitions of its nature and task. But even if these differences in defining the nature of phenomenology could be brought to a consensus, it would remain doubtful whether the concept of phenomenology thus attained a sort of average concept could direct us toward the concrete problems to be chosen. For we should have to be certain beforehand that phenomenological inquiry today has reached the center of philosophy's problems and has defined its own nature by that way of their possibilities. As we shall see, however, this is not the case, and so little is it the case that one of the main purposes of this course is to show that, conceived in its basic tendency, phenomenological research can represent nothing less than the more explicit, and the more radical understanding of the idea of a scientific philosophy, which philosophers from ancient times to Hegel sought to realize time and again in a variety of internally coherent endeavors. Hitherto, phenomenology has been understood even within that discipline itself as a science propedeutic to philosophy, preparing the ground for the proper philosophical disciplines of logic, ethics, aesthetics, and philosophy of religion. But in this definition, phenomenology as a preparatory science, the traditional stock of philosophical disciplines, is taken over without asking whether that same stock is not called in question and eliminated precisely by phenomenology itself. Does not phenomenology contain within itself the possibility of reversing the alienation of philosophy into these disciplines and of relativizing and reappropriating in its basic tendencies the great tradition of philosophy with essential answers? We shall maintain that phenomenology is not just one philosophical science among others, nor is it the science preparatory to the rest of them. Rather, the expression phenomenology is the name for the method of scientific philosophy in general. Clarification of the idea of phenomenology is equivalent to exposition of the concept of scientific philosophy. To be sure, this does not yet tell us what phenomenology means as far as its content is concerned, and it tells us even less about how this method is to be put into practice. But it does indicate how and why we must avoid aligning ourselves with any contemporary tendency in phenomenology. We shall not deduce the concrete phenomenological problems from some dogmatically proposed concept of phenomenology. On the contrary, we shall allow ourselves to be led. I'll say that again. On the contrary, we shall allow ourselves to be led to them by a more general and preparatory discussion of this concept of scientific philosophy in general. We shall conduct its discussion in tacit opposition to the basic tendencies of Western philosophy from antiquity to Hegel. In the early period of ancient thought, philosophia means the same as science in general. Later individual philosophies, that is to say, individual sciences, medicine, for instance, and mathematics, become detached from philosophy. The term philosophia then refers to a science which underlies and encompasses all the other particular sciences. Philosophy becomes science, pure and simple. More and more, it takes itself to be the first and highest science, or as it was called during the period of German idealism, absolute science. If philosophy is absolute science, then the expression scientific philosophy contains pleonasm. It then means scientific absolute science. It suffices simply to say philosophy. This already implies science pure and simple. Why then do we still add the adjective science to the expression philosophy? Science, not to speak of absolute science, is scientific by the very meaning of the term. We speak of scientific philosophy principally because conceptions of philosophy prevail which do not imperil but even negate its character as science pure and simple. These conceptions of philosophy are not just contemporary, but accompany the development of scientific philosophy throughout the time philosophy has existed as a science. On this view, philosophy is supposed not only, and not in the first place, to be a theoretical science, but to give practical guidance to our view of things and their interconnection and their attitudes toward them, and to regulate and direct our interpretation of existence and its meaning. Philosophy is wisdom of the world and of life. Or to use an expression currently nowadays, philosophy is supposed to provide a Weltanschauung of worldview. Scientific philosophy can thus be set off against philosophy as a worldview. We shall try to examine this distinction more critically and to decide whether it is valid or whether it has to be absorbed into one of its members. In this way, the concept of philosophy should become clear to us and put us in a position to justify the selection of the individual problems to be dealt with in the first part. It should be borne in mind here that these discussions concerning the concept of philosophy can only be provisional not just in regard to the course as a whole, but provisional in general. For the concept of philosophy is the most proper and highest result of philosophy itself. Similarly, the question whether philosophy is at all possible or not can be decided only by philosophy itself. 2. The concept of philosophy and worldview. In discussing the difference between scientific philosophy and philosophy as a worldview, we may fittingly start the latter notion and begin with the term Weltanschauung, worldview. This expression is not translated, or not a translation from Greek or Latin. There is no such expression as Kosmothoria. The word Weltanschauung is of specifically German coinage. It was, in fact, coined within philosophy. It first turns up in its natural meaning in Kant's critique of judgment, world intuition, in the sense of contemplation of the world given to the senses, or as Kant says, the mundus sensibilis, a beholding of the world as a simple apprehension of nature in the broadest sense. Goethe and Alexander von Humboldt thereupon used the word in this way. The usage dies out in the 30s of the last century under the influence of the new meaning of the expression Weltanschauung by the Romantics and principally by Schelling. In the Einleitung zu dem Entwurf, ein System der Naturphilosophie, introduction to the draft of a system of philosophy of nature, Schelling says, intelligence is productive in a double manner, either blindly or unconsciously, or freely and consciously. It is unconsciously productive in Weltanschauung and consciously productive in the creation of an ideal world. Here, Weltanschauung is directly assigned not to sense observation, but to intelligence, albeit an unconscious intelligence. Moreover, the factor of productivity, the independent formative processes of intuition, is emphasized. Thus, the word approaches the meaning we are familiar with today. A self-realized, productive, as well as conscious way of apprehending and interpreting the universe of beings. Schelling speaks of schematisms of Weltanschauung, a schematized form for the different possible worldviews, which appear and take shape, in fact. A view of the world understood in this way does not have to be produced with a theoretical intention and with the means of theoretical science. In his Phenomenology des Geistes, Phenomenology of Spirit, Hegel speaks of a moral worldview. Gorez makes use of the expression poetic worldview. Ranke speaks of the religious and Christian worldview. Mention is made sometimes of the democratic, sometimes the pessimistic worldview, or even the medieval worldview. Schleiermacher says, it is only our worldview that makes our knowledge of God complete. Bismarck at one point writes to his bride, what strange views of the world there are among clever people. For the forms and possibilities of worldview thus enumerated, it becomes clear that what is meant by this term is not only a conception of contexture, of natural things, but at the same time an interpretation of the sense and purpose of human Dasein, and sense, and hence of history. A worldview always includes a way of life. A worldview grows out of an all-inclusive reflection on the world and the human Dasein, and this again happens in different ways, explicitly and consciously in individuals, or by appropriating an already prevalent worldview. We grow up within such a worldview and gradually become accustomed to it. Our worldview is determined by environment, people, race, class, developmental stage of culture. Every worldview is thus individually formed, arises out of a natural worldview, out of a range of conceptions of the world and determinations of the human Dasein, which are at any particular time given more or less explicitly with each such Dasein. We must distinguish the individually formed worldview or the culturally worldview from the natural worldview. A worldview is not a matter of theoretical knowledge, either in respect of or of its origin or in relation to its use. It is not simply retained in memory like a parcel of cognitive property. Rather, it is a matter of coherent conviction which determines the current state of affairs of life more or less expressly and directly. A worldview is related in its meaning to the particular contemporary Dasein at any given time. In this relationship to the Dasein, the worldview is a guide to it and a source of strength under pressure, whether the worldview is determined by superstition and prejudice or is based purely on scientific knowledge and experience, or even, as it usually is the case, is a mixture of superstition, knowledge, prejudice, and sober reason. It all comes to the same thing. Nothing, essentially, is changed. This indication of the characteristic traits of what we mean by the term worldview may suffice here. A rigorous definition of it would have to be gained in another way, as we shall see. In the Psychologie die Weltanschauung, Jaspers says that when we speak of worldviews, we mean ideas, what is ultimate and total in man, both subjectively as life experience and power and character, and objectively as a world having objective shape. For our purpose of distinguishing between philosophy as worldview and scientific philosophy, it is above all important to see that the worldview in this meaning always arises out of the particular factical existence of the human being in accordance with his factical possibilities of thoughtful reflection and attitude formation, and it arises thus for the factical Dasein. This worldview is something that in each case exists historically from, with, and for the factical Dasein. The philosophic worldview is one that expressly and explicitly, or at any rate, preponderantly, has to be worked out and brought about by philosophy. That is to say, by theoretical speculation, to the exclusion of artistic and religious interpretations of the world and Dasein. This worldview is not a byproduct of philosophy. Its cultivation, rather, is the proper goal and nature of philosophy itself. In its very concept, philosophy is world-view philosophy. Philosophy as worldview. If philosophy in the form of theoretical knowledge of the world aims at what is universal in the world and ultimate for the Dasein, the whence, the whither, and the wherefore of the world and life, then this differentiates it from the particular sciences, which always consider only a particular region of the world and the Dasein, as well as from the artistic and the religious attitudes, which are not based primarily on the theoretical attitude. It seems to be without question that philosophy has as its goal the formation of a worldview. This task must define the nature and concept of philosophy. Philosophy, it appears, is so essentially worldview philosophy that it would be preferable to reject this latter expression as an unnecessary overstatement. And what is even more, to propose to strive for a scientific philosophy is a misunderstanding. For the philosophical worldview, it is said, naturally ought to be scientific. By this is meant, first, that it should take cognizance of the results of the different sciences and then use them in constructing a world picture and the interpretation of the Dasein. Secondly, that it ought to be scientific by forming the worldview in strictly conformity with the rules of scientific thought. This conception of philosophy as the formation of a worldview in a theoretical way is so much taken for granted that it commonly and widely defines the concept of philosophy and consequently also prescribes for the popular mind what is to be and what ought to be expected of philosophy. Conversely, if philosophy does not give satisfactory answers to the question of worldview, the popular mind regards it as significant. Demands made on philosophy and attitudes taken towards it are governed by this notion of it as the scientific construction of a worldview. To determine whether philosophy succeeds or fails in this task, its history is examined for unequivocal confirmation that it deals knowingly with the ultimate questions of nature, of the soul, that is to say, of the freedom and history of man, of God. If philosophy is the scientific construction of a worldview, then the distinction between scientific philosophy and philosophy as worldview, what is really emphasized ultimately, is the task of the worldview. This seems also to be the view of Kant, who put the scientific character of philosophy on a new basis. We need only recall the distinction he drew up in the introduction to the logic between the academic and the cosmic conceptions of philosophy. Here we turn to the often quote Kantian distinction, which apparently supports the distinction between scientific philosophy and philosophy as a worldview, or more exactly, serves as evidence for the fact that Kant himself, for whom scientific character of philosophy was central, likewise conceived of philosophy as philosophical worldview. So let's see how how long this goes for. So it goes up to page 46. More 43, 3 more pages. Well, let's see how we get on. Kant himself, for whom the scientific character of philosophy was central, likewise conceives of philosophy as philosophical worldview. According to the academic concept, or as Kant also says, in the scholastic sense, philosophy as the doctrine of the skill of reason and includes two parts. First, a sufficient stock of rational cognitions from concepts, and secondly, a systematic interconnection of these cognitions, or a combination of them in the idea of a whole. Kant's thought here is that philosophy in the scholastic sense includes the interconnection of the formal principles of thought and of reason in general, as well as the discussion and determination of those concepts which, as a necessary presupposition, underlie our apprehension of the world, that is to say, for Kant, of nature. According to the academic concept, philosophy is the whole of the formal and material fundamental concepts and principles of rational knowledge. Kant defines the cosmic concept of philosophy, or as he also says, philosophy in the cosmopolitan sense as follows, quote, "But as regards philosophy in the cosmic sense, sensu cosmico, it can also be called the science of the supreme maxims of the use of our reason, understanding by maxims the inner principle of choice among diverse ends. Philosophy in the cosmic sense deals with that for the sake of which all use of reason, including that of philosophy itself, is what it is. For philosophy in the later sense is indeed the science of the relation of every use of knowledge and reason to the final purpose of human reason, under which the supreme end, all other ends are subordinated and must come together into unity in it. In this cosmopolitan sense, the field of philosophy can be defined by the following questions. What can I know? What should I do? What may I hope? And what is man?" And here's some, in this footnote here, Heidegger is dealing a lot with critique of pure reason. At bottom, says Kant, the first three questions are concentrated in the fourth, what is man? For the determination of the final ends of human reason result from the explanation of what man is. It is to these ends that philosophy in the academic sense must also relate. Does these Kantian separation between philosophy in the scholastic sense and philosophy in the cosmopolitan sense coincide with the distinction between scientific philosophy and philosophy as worldview? Yes and no. Yes, since Kant, after all, makes a distinction within the concept of philosophy, and on the basis of this distinction makes the question of the end and limits of human existence central. No, since philosophy in the cosmic sense does not have the task of developing a worldview in the designated sense. What Kant ultimately has in mind as the task of philosophy in the cosmic sense, without being able to say so explicitly, is nothing but the a priori and therefore ontological circumscription of the characteristic which belong to the essential nature of human Dasein, and which also generally determine the concept of worldview. As the most fundamental a priori determination of the essential nature of the human Dasein, Kant recognizes the proposition, man is a being which exists as its own end. Philosophy in the cosmic sense, as Kant understands it, also has to do with determinations of essential nature. It does not seek a specific factual account of the merely factual known world and the merely factual lived life. Rather, it seeks to delimit what belongs to world in general, to the Dasein in general, and thus to the worldview in general. Philosophy in the cosmic sense has for Kant exactly the same methodological character as philosophy in the academic sense, except that for reasons which we shall not discuss here in further detail, Kant does not see the connection between the two. More precisely, he does not see the basis for establishing both concepts on a common original ground. We shall deal with this later on. For the present, it is clear only that if philosophy is viewed as being the scientific construction of a worldview, Appeal should not be made to Kant. Fundamentally, Kant recognizes only philosophy as science. A worldview, as we saw, springs in every case from the factical Dasein in accordance with its factical possibilities. And it is what it is in each case for this particular Dasein. This in no way asserts a relativism of worldviews. What a worldview fashioned in this way says can be formulated in propositions and rules which are related in their meaning to a specific really existing world, to the particular factical existing Dasein. Every worldview and life view posits, that is to say, it is related beingly to some being or beings. If it posits a being, something that is, it is positive. A worldview belongs to each Dasein, and, like this Dasein, it is in each case determined in a factical, historical way. To the worldview there belongs this multiple positivity, that in each case it is rooted in a Dasein, which is in such and such a way that as such it relates to the existing world and points to the factically existent Dasein. It is just because this positivity, we'll finish down here. It is just because this positivity, that is, the relatedness to beings, to world, that is, Dasein, that is, belongs to the essence of the worldview, and thus in general to the formation of the worldview, that the formation of a worldview cannot be the task of philosophy. To say this is not to exclude, but to include the idea that philosophy is itself a distinctive primal form of worldview. Philosophy can and perhaps must show, among many other things, that something like a worldview belongs to essential nature of the Dasein. Philosophy can and must define what in general constitutes the structure of a worldview, but it can never develop and posit some specific worldview qua just this or that particular one. Philosophy is not essentially the formation of a worldview, but perhaps just on this account, it has an elementary and fundamental relation to all worldview formation, even to that which is not theoretical, but factically historical. The thesis that worldview formation does not belong to the task of philosophy is valid, of course, only on the presupposition that philosophy does not relate in a positive manner to some being qua this or that particular being. That is, that it does not posit a being. Can this presupposition that philosophy does not relate positively to beings as the signs do be justified? What then is philosophy supposed to concern itself with, if not with beings? With that which is, as well as with the whole of it, of what was it not, is surely the nothing. Should philosophy then and absolute science have the nothing as its theme? What can there be apart from nature, history, God, space, number? We say of each of these, even though in a different sense, that it is, we call it a being. In relating to it, whether theoretically or practically, we are comporting ourselves towards a being. Beyond all these beings, there is nothing. Perhaps there is no other being beyond. Perhaps there's no other being beyond what has been enumerated. But perhaps, as in the German idiom, for there is, es gibt, literally it gives, still something else is given. And this is really, really important. It gives, es gibt, even more. In the end, something is given, which must be given if we are to be able to make beings accessible to us, beings, and comport ourselves towards them, something which, to be sure, is nothing but, which must be given if we are to experience and understand any beings at all. We are able to grasp beings as such, as beings only if we understand something like being. If we did not understand, even though at first roughly with and without conceptual comprehension, what actually signifies, then the actual would remain hidden from us. If we did not understand what reality means, then the real would remain inaccessible. If we did not understand what life and vitality signify, then we would not be able to comport ourselves towards living beings. If we did not understand what existence and existentiality signify, then we ourselves would not be able to exist as Dasein. If we did not understand the permanence and constancy signify, then constant geometric relations or numerical proportions would remain a secret to us. We must understand actuality, reality, and vitality, existentiality, constancy in order to be able to comport ourselves positively towards specifically actual, real, living, existing, constant beings. We must understand being so that we may be able to be given over to a world that is, so that we can exist in it and be our own Dasein itself as a being. We must be able to understand actuality before all experience of all things. This understanding of actuality or of being in the widest sense over against the experience of beings as in a certain sense earlier than the experience of beings. To say that the understanding of being precedes all factual experience of being does not mean that we would first need to have an explicit concept of being in order to experience beings theoretically or practically. We must understand being which may no longer itself be called a being which does not occur as a being amongst other beings, but which nevertheless must be given, and in fact is given in the understanding of being. So one thing that stood out for me here, let me see if I can find it, but it was to do with the presupposition. Yeah, so here we have it. So on page 10, we finished on page 11. So what do we have? The thesis that the worldview formation does not belong to the task of philosophy is valid, of course, only on the presupposition that philosophy does not relate in a positive manner. Can this presupposition that philosophy does not relate positively to beings as science be justified? What then is philosophy supposed to concern itself if not with beings, with that which is as well as with the whole of what is? What is not is surely the nothing. Should philosophy then, as absolute science, have the nothing as its theme? What there can be apart from nature, God, space, number? So philosophy does not relate in a positive manner to some being. So and this is a question that I'm thinking through this with you as you listen. Is philosophy skeptical in this sense? The thesis that worldview formation does not belong to the task of philosophy is valid, of course, only on the presupposition that philosophy does not relate in a positive manner. Can this presupposition that philosophy does not relate positively to beings as the science do be justified? So we have two things here, is philosophy negation? As Heidegger says, is philosophy concerned with the nothing? And, Heidegger then goes on and says, if we are to experience any understanding of beings, we are able to grasp beings as such only if we understand something like being. Now, my question, and I'll read over this again, and I'll put, when I do get time, I'll put something into the chat or into the comment section. I was reading a lot of Hoolgate this year in the past year. Introduction to the Logic, his two books, well, his first main book on being in the Science of Logic. And Hoolgate is making the argument that Hegel is a non-presuppositionless philosopher, particularly in the Science of Logic. The whole point of the Phenomenology is to purge natural consciousness for us to be able to think thought immanently. Now, this question of what a presupposition is extremely important, because it seems to me that Heidegger is saying we need these presuppositions here. If we did not understand what permanence and constancy signify, then constant geometric relations or numerical propositions would remain a secret to us. We must be able to understand actuality before all experience of actual things. To say that understanding of being precedes all factual experience does not mean that we would first need to have an explicit concept. It's a fire, great, gone by. So the question of, in Heidegger, the pre-ontological knowledge of something, then the ontological knowledge of something, and then in Hegel, presuppositions. And then this distinction in our time of what is scientific knowledge. I mean, a lot of people wouldn't say that philosophy is scientific. So these are some questions that are coming up after reading the first two aphorisms in the basic phenomenology of basic problems of phenomenology in Heidegger. Okay, till next time. Take care.